contemporary relevance, particularly to Mana Manchi Pustakam, is a YouTube initiative by a group of. Is that okay? My voice, is that okay?
Yes, it's so. As far as I'm concerned, it's okay.
Yeah, fine. Then it's an initiative of a few people who thought of introducing the books to the new generation who are more tuned to the new forms of reading through audio books, video books like. And we also decided to introduce the books of contemporary Indian relevance. As a part of that initiative, we decided to introduce and discuss today's book, Resistible Rise, a Fascism Reader. As we all know, throughout the world, not only about in India, throughout the world, there is a heated debate about the changing orientations and approaches of the ruling dispensations, which are becoming more and more autocratic and to some extent fascism of various shades and colors. So there is a huge confusion about what is fascism and what is not. What is to be government or dispensation to be identified with fascism and what is not, and to what extent to be identified with fascism. So in all these aspects, I found a huge, interesting discussion and compilation of articles running uh, into about 70, 75 years of experiences of particularly European nations who have gone through the phase of fascism, and governments which are inclined to implement or invoke at least certain aspects of what we are calling fascism. So in this context, I requested Shashwati to accept my request, and then she guided me to Market ji and also Anil ji. I thank on behalf of Manji Pustakam team, all three of you for accepting my suggestion. I request Professor Anil Bhatt ji to chair the session and initiate the discussion. Professor Bhatt ji.
Thank you, Viraya. I'm very happy to be here. It's a very important topic, and I think it is one in which all over the world something is being discussed.
Small interruption. Basically, we are using Zoom to launch the event with uninterrupted event. This will be simultaneously going live in YouTube directly. So those who are having trouble in accessing Zoom, they can access the YouTube Manamanchi Pustakam and follow the event there. Thank you.
Oh, good. That will ensure a wider circulation. But first of all, I'm very happy to be here and to be part of this discussion, which, as far as I can see, is a topic widely discussed in conferences and in seminars practically all over the world, because for a long time, the development of our societies in India and Europe and other parts of the world have led to a situation in which exact characterization is not possible without in some way or the other invoking the term fascism with whichever modification you wish to have. Now, this discussion started in India, of course, very long ago, and one of the landmarks, in my opinion, was the Reader, which Margaret Kovesh and Shashwati Mazumdar edited and brought out in the year 2005, which contains some of the most important papers or essays on this topic, largely based on the European experience of fascism and the discussions in the Weimar period of Germany. And this book was widely received and discussed. There have been other collections which have come later, and they should not be ignored. One was a collection published by three paper collective, edited by Jairus Banerjee, which contained also the important paper by Arthur Rosenberg and some Indian analyses of contemporary Indian society, and such things which have been going on for a very long time in the pages of journals like Social Scientist and other organs, which try to characterize, discuss what is the nature of the Indian state, where is it heading, and in what way can the term fascism be applied to it. There is no need to go into this in detail. I'm sure the speakers will do it. So let me immediately then proceed and welcome both Margit and Shashwati to this meeting. Which is the order in which you will be speaking, both of you?
I'll speak first.
You'll speak first.
Mari will speak it after that.
Okay. So then, without further ado, I'll ask Shashwati to start the proceedings. And 30 minutes is what we had agreed on.
Yeah.
And I think that should be enough.
Yeah.
Okay, Shash, over to you.
Okay, so let me begin by thanking the organizers of this discussion. Actually, the book, as mentioned by Anil Bhatti, was published in 2005, more than 16 years ago. And I had, at least, I can say for myself, more or less forgotten about it as more recent political events overtook our lives. It is only your interest in organizing this discussion that forced me to return to the book. Anyway, the context at the time when we brought out this book was the emergence of right-wing movements in India, as well as in other parts of the world, with openly fundamentalist, sectarian, and chauvinist agendas based on race, ethnicity, religion, etc. Such movements emerged across many parts of Europe and also in the United States, with several of them achieving significant electoral successes. The specific context in India was the emergence of the BJP as a political force, the Gujarat pogroms, etc., though it was yet to assume power at the center. Things have changed quite dramatically since then. Most importantly for us in India, with the BJP coming to power in 2014 and getting re-elected with a much bigger majority in 2019, and all that has followed since then. The objective of the reader was to highlight Marxist perspectives on the phenomenon of fascism, as it first emerged in the first half of the 20th century, to see how they could help us understand the more recent contemporary right-wing organizations and movements. It needs to be said before we proceed further that we, the editors of this collection, do not come from a social science background, but from a language and literature disciplinary background, specifically German and Hungarian. What we nevertheless hoped to be able to do was to provide an access to the debates, for instance, within the German-speaking world, where the issue dominated post-war discourse far more than perhaps anywhere else. We could also include a few pieces that we translated from German or Hungarian into English, specifically for the reader. We could also provide, as we hoped, some pointers about the cultural sphere to which well-known philosophers and literary figures try to draw attention. The idea, so if there are any criticisms of the book, one should keep this in mind, the kind of background that we come from, and that it was an effort despite that background. The idea of focusing specifically on Marxist perspectives was because they differed in significant ways from the dominant perspectives, and because they drew attention to what the dominant perspectives sought to cover up. Most importantly, the integral connection between fascism and capitalism that fascism emerged at a time of intense crisis for capitalism as a means to overcome the crisis and re-establish its dominance. Of course, there were significant differences even amongst Marxists, as can be found in the reader, but there were also some fundamental agreements. The reader is divided into 3 sections. The first bringing together 6 essays, post-war, that is post-Second World War Marxist writings by scholars, academics. This is the first section. The second focuses on writings of the interwar period, that is the period between the 2 world wars. This section features writings by leading figures of the communist movement of the time. The third section, about which my colleague will speak more in detail, has writings by philosophers and literary figures, also from the interwar period, reflecting on how fascist ideology functioned in the sphere of culture. A major focus of the reader, as has been actually pointed out by our chairperson for today, is on German fascism. There are references to Italy and Hungary too. One flaw of the reader is perhaps that it does not include anything on fascism in Japan. The introduction tries to outline the context within which the post-war and interwar pieces were written, describe the major debates, and make some observations about the contemporary forms of fascism. This is what I will try to briefly present. The political developments and climate after the defeat of fascism and the end of the Second World War, particularly in Germany, West Germany at the time, provide some insights into how anti-Marxist theories came to dominate. Initially, popular opinion was sharply critical of capitalism, and particularly of big business for their support and active collaboration with the fascists. This changed, however, quite soon, as Europe was divided into the capitalist and socialist camps. The Cold War began, and the Western powers launched an anti-communist offensive. With West Germany at the front line of the Iron Curtain, the offensive was particularly sharp there. Popular demands for socialization of big business and denazification of institutions were pushed back, and many leading figures from the Nazi regime were reinstalled in powerful positions. This created the ideological climate for the theories of fascism that came to dominate political and academic discourse. These theories have overlaps and commonalities in their approaches and were often used together, but they can still be distinguished by the specific aspects that they highlight or emphasize. Broadly, we identify 5 theories. First, the theory of the Führer state. The second is fascism as totalitarianism. The third, fascism as a movement of the petty bourgeoisie. Fourth, fascism as a result of national peculiarities. And fifth, the theory of the centrality of the Holocaust. What were the arguments of these theories? The first, the theory of the Führer state, as the name suggests, basically identified Hitler as the root of all evil, as an evil demonic figure who was either imposed on an unsuspecting populace or became the expression of the people's organic will. The second theory, of fascism as totalitarianism, this became perhaps the most influential theory and continues to be very influential, as it could be deployed to argue that fascism and communism were 2 sides of the same coin, both enemies of democracy, parliamentary democracy. But it was always named democracy. The third theory, fascism as a movement of the petty bourgeoisie. It is worth noting here that the Nazis in fact set out to wean away workers from the organized working class movement, represented by the Social Democrats and Communists. This is why they called themselves the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So the term has both the word socialist, qualified by the adjective national, and it has the word workers in it. But they were largely unsuccessful in this objective, as research has shown that their mass support was mainly among the petty bourgeoisie or the middle classes. This theory of fascism as a movement of the petty bourgeoisie argued that fascism was a kind of rebellion by these classes, both against capitalism and against the threat of socialism. It was both anti-capitalist and anti-socialist. The fourth theory, which is called fascism as a result of national peculiarities, set out to explain the extreme forms that fascism took in Germany by tracing its origins to Germany's political and social backwardness, its delayed nationhood, and inadequately developed bourgeois democratic institutions, all of which laid the ground for the rise of reactionary ideologies. And finally, the fifth theory, which talks about the centrality of the Holocaust. This theory saw the concentration camps and the mass extermination of Jews as the defining feature of fascism, a feature which had to be morally condemned as singular crimes against humanity. These crimes were seen as being beyond rational comprehension, so that attempts to look for rational explanations or identify which social interests were served tended to be seen as relativizing the crimes. Despite their significant differences, all these theories stood in the way of studying precisely which social interests benefited from the fascist dictatorship and its murderous regime. It is against the dominance of these theories that Marxist interpretations started to emerge around the 60s in the context of re-emerging crises, the end of the post-war economic boom period, the Vietnam War, the 1968 student uprisings, etc. But they continued to face an environment hostile to Marxism. Before we come to the post-war Marxist debates, let us look briefly at the period in which fascism first emerged and how leading figures of the communist movement analyzed it. The pieces included in the reader are by, most of them are well-known names, Antonio Gramsci and Palmiro Togliatti, communist leaders from Italy, Clara Zetkin and August Thalheimer from Germany, Georg Lukács, who straddled the Hungarian and German worlds as he did those of politics, philosophy, and culture, the Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov, and Daniel Guerin, who, unlike the others, was a journalist, though also an active supporter of anti-colonialist and working class movements. Guerin wrote a book called Fascism and Big Business that studies the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany and elsewhere, and its relationship to big business, which is why we also included a piece by him. As we know, fascism first emerged in Italy under Mussolini, who started out as a socialist, but shifted during the First World War away from his earlier beliefs to support for the war and to nationalism as an ideology and movement aimed at transcending the class conflicts that had given birth to the socialist and communist movements. Opposition or support for the war became, as we also know, one of the major lines of difference that led to the split in the socialist movement across Europe, that is the organized working class movement across Europe, and to the emergence of communist parties who opposed the war as an imperialist war for the redivision of the world. A characteristic feature of the fascist groups that emerged at the time was their espousal of ultranationalist ideologies aimed at transcending class conflicts. In this sense, they were attractive to the ruling classes for justifying their drive to war and confronting the challenge from the working class movement, both during and after the war. In the interwar debate among leading communists, there was broad agreement on some aspects. One, that fascist tendencies emerged as an international phenomenon in the context of capitalism's transition from free competition to monopoly capitalism or imperialism, and the aggravation of crisis that led to both to the First World War and to the October Revolution in Russia. This is the context that they identify. Secondly, that fascists attacked the working class and its organizations. Thirdly, they also set out to destroy all bourgeois democratic rights that had been achieved through struggle, rights, institutions, etc. Fourthly, fascism stood for militarization and war. And finally, that their mass support came from the petty bourgeoisie and the middle strata, for whom increasing economic insecurity meant the threat of being thrown into the ranks of the working class. This is what made them susceptible to the fascists. These sections were most susceptible to fascist demagoguery, with its rhetorical anti-capitalism and its real attack on the working class. However, there was general agreement that they could also be won over as an ally of the working class. It is important to note that the communists were trying to understand a completely new phenomenon, and they were among the first to analyze it. They were also practically engaged with developing urgent strategies for fighting it. Their focus was on understanding the role that fascist movements and parties played. What was the nature of the relationship between these parties and big business, and what kind of united front was necessary to defeat it. They were also trying to understand how fascism functioned in different parts of Europe at that time, basically. Germany, Hungary, Italy, and elsewhere, with their different levels and trajectories of development. Some parts of Europe poorer than others, which was also a factor which they looked at. These questions were also of concern to the post-war debates among Marxists, but in a very different environment. They were scholars studying fascism mainly as a phenomenon from the past, although recognizing its continuing danger for the present and the future. They were also putting forward their arguments in an environment dominated by anti-Marxist theories and hostile to Marxism. Broadly, four strands can be identified in the post-war debates amongst Marxists. First, what was primary, the political behavior of the fascists or the economic interests that they served? The British historian Tim Mason argued that the ruling classes chose the radical means offered by the Nazis to re-establish the authority of the state and ward off the threat from the organized working class movement. But that, as he argued, beyond 1936, the Nazi regime became increasingly independent of the ruling classes and in some respects even opposed to their interests. According to him, ideologically determined policy eventually overrode economic calculations, which led to the more extreme forms of violence. This was an important aspect which people were preoccupied with, the extreme forms of violence that German fascism took. Kurt Gossweiler, a historian of the GDR, maintains that politics and economics, I mean, the question was what has primacy, politics or economics? And his answer to the question is politics and economics are inextricably linked, that the ruling classes made a political choice to back the Nazis in order to reassert their political and thereby economic power against the challenge posed by the working class. A similar debate centered on whether the fascist regime was an alliance of the capitalist class and the fascists, or was it the dictatorship of monopoly capital. The West German political scientist Reinhard Kühnel agrees that the logic of imperialism's drive for war and the need to smash the organized working class opposition required a dictatorial state with a chauvinist ideology. But he also argues that understanding the relationship between the capitalist class and the fascists as an alliance could explain the extreme levels of inhumane violence demonstrated in the gassing of millions of Jews. The East German Kurt Gossweiler argues that capitalism in the stage of imperialism and monopoly capital is inherently inimical to democracy and is drawn to fascist ideology, particularly so when it feels threatened not only from the domestic working class, but also from the victory of the proletarian revolution in Russia. In this situation, the monopoly bourgeoisie, as he points out, is both offensive and defensive, and it is the dialectic of these two sides that defines fascism. Another issue in the debates was whether fascism generally needed a mass movement in all parts, wherever it emerged. Reinhard Kühnel distinguishes between any other terrorist dictatorship and one that relies on a mass movement. He argues that only the latter is fascist. This, according to Gossweiler, draws attention away from the behavior of the ruling classes, whose degree of determination to strengthen their position through dictatorial means is what is decisive, regardless of whether it is backed by a mass movement. Finally, no, before that, there's one more. Another focus of some Marxist intellectuals was the mass psychology of fascism and how susceptibility to authoritarian structures and thinking was promoted by the inner logic of capitalism. These theories, as Kühnel argues, tend to suggest the inevitable support of the petty bourgeoisie and middle classes for fascism. For Gossweiler, the issue is how to prevent these classes, which he considers the natural allies of the working class, from going to the fascists. Kurt Petzold, another GDR historian, underlines the need to combine fascist ideology with terror to achieve this mass support, as well as the unstable nature of this support both before and after accession to power. The reader also has one article by the Polish economist Michał Kalecki on more recent post-war versions of fascist groups in Europe and the US, that is in the 60s. Kalecki draws attention to a specific difference in regard to these post-war fascist groups. One function of Nazism, he argues, was to overcome resistance to government intervention, of course, for the purpose of stimulating business. The Nazi regime invested heavily, of course, in preparations for war, but they generated business in arms and employment on a large scale. In the post-war period, government intervention became normal and integral to capitalism when, Keynesian theory became widely deployed everywhere, and the welfare state became a sort of norm, at least in Europe, if not in the United States. In the post-war period, government intervention became normal and integral to capitalism. And in this context, the post-war fascist groups gave up their anti-capitalist rhetoric and started attacking what they called government interference. What was common to all of them was their racism, chauvinism, and anti-trade union and anti-communist attitudes. The ruling classes did not want these fascists in power, but neither were they ready to crush them. Instead, as Kaleski argues, they kept them like a dog on a leash that could be used to intimidate and be unleashed whenever required. Kaleski's observations were made in regard to the post-war boom period with large-scale government investments, high employment, and welfare benefits that all served to stimulate business, while at the same time serving to contain threats of social revolution. These policies started changing from the 70s with the shift to neoliberalism. So now with that, we come to more recent times. And those are the times in which we actually put the reader together. While putting together the reader, the question before us was also the relationship between contemporary fascist groups and tendencies, globalization or the neoliberal economic order, and the imperialist offensive seen at the time in the wars on Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. The onset of neoliberal policies was both a reflection of the crisis of capitalism and the means adopted to reassert its economic hegemony. The push to privatize large sectors so far controlled and regulated by the government, the systematic erosion of social welfare measures, the attack on labor rights, and reversal of the economic and political gains made by the working class. These policies became ever more aggressive after the collapse of the socialist bloc and the unipolar world that seemed to have emerged following this collapse. These policies impacted the countries of the developing world in a way that threatened their relative independence and autonomy that had characterized the previous phase and reasserted their dependence on imperialism. The transition to capitalism in the former socialist countries, in most places through what is called shock therapy, not only adversely affected the economies and societies of these countries, but by undoing their opposition to imperialism, it helped to consolidate imperialist hegemony even over the developing world. In the initial period of the neoliberal reforms, the moves towards privatization and deregulation tended to be seen as the retreat of the state, as ever larger sectors were handed over to private hands. But in reality, the state that earlier appeared to be functioning in the interests of society as a whole emerged as one functioning openly in the interests of monopoly capital. For countries of the developing world, this meant a further integration with and dependence on imperialism. Moreover, we also saw in this period the tendency to break up larger states into smaller entities that can be more easily controlled by imperialism. Even more so with the new states often being based on ethnic, religious, linguistic lines of inclusion and exclusion. So rather than retreating, the state emerged as a more active and assertive player, though now with the function of shifting the balance of forces towards the interests of big business. In this context, political groups with sectarian divisive ideologies have become attractive for the ruling classes, as these groups divert attention away from the increasing discontent and divide collective united resistance by the working people. Opposition to imperialism by any of the states in the world comes with high costs. They are designated as rogue states, authoritarian dictatorships, and so on, and sanctions are imposed on them to deny them the possibility of any independent development. In the advanced capitalist countries, the growing flood of migrants fleeing the economic misery as well as the death and destruction imposed by neoliberal policies and imperialist wars have become a target of fascist groups. This scenario not only fueled the rise of fascist political groups with divisive and chauvinist ideologies, but also the tendency to perceive and define contemporary inequities and injustice on cultural, ethnic, religious, caste lines, shorn of class content. This often unwittingly provides scope for appropriation of the legitimate anger against real injustice by fascist groups, as also for meddling by imperialism. All this has tended to further obscure the class interests that gave birth to fascism and that continue to profit from the fascist tendencies of our times. These tendencies have got greatly strengthened since the Reader was published, but opposition has also started to emerge in different forms and in different parts of the world. In India, for instance, we had the historic farmers' struggle that became victorious through their determination to sustain the struggle, but also most significantly through a process of learning to overcome the disunity in their ranks brought about through divisive propaganda and engineered riots by the BJP. We also see several countries, as for instance in Latin America, trying to shed their dependence on imperialism. And the geopolitical tensions of our times, however messy and even alarming, do demonstrate that the unipolar moment emerging after the collapse of the socialist bloc is coming to an end. I think that it is particularly helpful to also note that the ruling classes at home and abroad are both offensive and defensive, that the mass support that they may enjoy is unstable, and that this support base can be won over to the fight against fascism and for a more just social order. It is for the anti-fascist political forces and intellectuals of our times to analyze and work out the way forward. We hope that the Reader can be of some help in this process. So that brings me to the end of my sort of introduction to the book, and my co-editor will now take over.
Thank you, Shash. Okay, Margaret, then please go on.
Thank you, Shashwati. Sorry if I repeat some of the things which Shashwati has said. I also tried to analyze the development since the writing, the editing of the book, since the publication of Resistible Rise in 2005, the situation has somewhat changed. In the first part of this account, I would like to take up trends which have become more pronounced, and later I will speak about the 3 pieces which were published in the art and culture part of the Reader, and take some digressions about various highlighting Adorno's and Lukács' role in taking up the questions of issues in fascism. The process of globalization that was already present in the 70s under the name structural adjustment in economics and deregulation of the financial markets has become overwhelming. Unemployment and impoverishment mean greater inequalities, marginalization, and exclusion of large masses of people. The social groups of immigrants expanded even more. They were 175 million in 2000, according to the ILO, and their number increased to 272 million in 2020. Migrant workers contribute to the economies of their host countries, and the remittances they send home help boost the economies of their countries of origin. The COVID-19 epidemic and the economic slump meant that migrant workers were the first to lose their jobs, and they often had inadequate medical assistance and health insurance to deal with the epidemic. One of the main features of fascism is the withdrawal of emancipation, the withdrawal of citizenship, equality before the law, and the equal social status. Equal social status, I mean universal social security, free medical care, and schooling. The essence of fascism is the destruction of citizenship, as it was established in 1789 in the French Revolution. In the so-called liberal democracies, this happens whether it is France or the United States or India. Akar Patel, in his talk on your channel, spoke about the various forms of nationalism, and he highlighted civic nationalism among the forms. That means citizenship and equal social status for all members of society. The growth of economic inequalities and neoliberalism energized identity politics based on ethnicity, religion, and culture. Economic and educational deprivation is more and more defined in terms of religious, ethnic, and cultural parameters. Multiculturalism is the ideology of globalization. Global culture addresses groups and group identities and dismisses individuals and communities. This contributes to the curtailment of legal rights, procedures, and practices, and promotes the rights of a particular group. It also supports the idea of multinational companies taking over the responsibilities of state. Education, daycare, social network, insurance, and pension, which amounts to the limitations of the citizens' rights. The emerging system shows the logic of global capital. The current trend of multicultural politics mobilizes interests and identities according to their cultural ethnic constructs. The political economic solution, that is the class contact, class connection, the group as a class, would give possibilities for building wider alliances, while identity is unable to identify joint political issues and aims with other groups. The neoliberal state finds criteria on the basis of some social groups, and on the basis of some social groups are eligible for state resources and some are not. This is also the introduction of fascist consciousness, a coalition of those who have income against those who do not have access to state resources. Very often, these are the migrants. While multinational capital is increasingly internationalized and the nation-state has a decreasing role, politically neutral public discourse in the various media displays the absence of ideology. Issues are discussed without questions or interpretation. The Hungarian philosopher Miklós Tamás Gáspár comments, I quote him, "Hungary and the world go through the process of fascicization without the fascists taking over the power." Unquote. Fascism of the beginning of the 21st century is the articulation and translation of racism and ethnicity into politics. The specific feature of the contemporary form of fascism is that it doesn't overthrow parliamentary democracy. It finds a convenient place within global capitalism displaying old and new forms of fascist consciousness. This new form of fascism as a political movement is different from fascism in the 20s and 30s, when its main adversary was the Comintern and left social democracy. Media, art and culture facilitate the spread of fascist ideology, and the main elements of this are reactionary cultural criticism, life philosophy, rationality, that is the apology of capitalism, creation of myths, glorification of instincts, and racism. Internet and media are very powerful forces in circulating and mobilizing these. Internet has over 560 million users in India, and the penetration is about half of the population. Facebook is strongly present with 324 million users, which is the 23% of the entire population. This also shows a kind of dependence and vulnerability to trolls and hoax of the internet. In the 1930s, at the rise of fascism in Germany, communists and social democrats pursued internationalism. Now, universality and internationalism went out of the vocabulary of the left. For example, in the area of migrants, camps, and passing migrants back to their location of domicile where shocking treatment could expect them, these issues could be addressed keeping in mind universality and internationalism. In the Reader, we had 3 pieces on culture and art. One by Ernst Bloch, From the Heritage of Our Time, one by Georg Lukács, The Fascist Falsification of Goethe, and Brecht's speech at the First International Writers' Congress in 1935 in Paris, a necessary observation on the fight against barbarism. Bloch wrote The Heritage of Our Times in the period when fascism came to power, and it was published in 1935 in Switzerland. It is very valuable from the point of view that it gives an insight to the everyday life of fascist Germany, the ideas and the various phenomena that circulated. Bloch suggests in Heritage of Our Time that the mental world of the petit bourgeois and the middle strata of society is influenced by atavistic elements of consciousness from earlier times, like traditional costumes, the bow and arrow, by manly, so-called manly qualities, blood and soil. Young people take fancy, are attracted to this, and they seek friends and a father figure, and therefore they are easily attracted to the Nazis. The peasantry may believe in witches, but they are far less exposed to beliefs and in the forces of blood and the manipulations of the great man. Bloch thinks the proletariat that directly participates in production is the least susceptible to fascist ideology. The title of the Reader refers to Brecht's play, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. It is an allegory of Hitler's rise to power and the beginning of the fascist state. Arturo Ui is a character in the cauliflower market in Chicago, and the play depicts in an allegorical way how he gains control over everything, similarly to Hitler. In the Reader, we also have Brecht's speech in the First International Writers' Congress in Paris in 1935, that he visited from his place of exile in Denmark. He made a point about the overall destruction by fascism, whether it is crops, cattle, and culture, they are all equally destroyed. He also presents the idea that traditional ways of depiction and performance do not work. Describing atrocities in great numbers numbs the spectator. The piece also highlights brutality that counters culture and fascist ideas of education. Self-discipline, physical courage, the mindset of the subordinate were ideas which were instilled in children who grew up in the decades after the fascist takeover. The elements of obedience without thinking, mindless fulfillment of orders had been ideas of middle-class education, which also helped, so it was even earlier it was present, but they helped the Nazis to take over the political scene. Brecht's point was that until private property relations persist, brutality and cruelty will be unavoidable parts of life. Now I take a digression to Adorno about education. Adorno, in a piece he wrote about the elements of education that encouraged the development of Nazi followers and youth. One of the demands of the 1968 movement in Germany was to change the atmosphere and spirit of education to bring up autonomous thinking individuals. An additional demand was the thorough rewriting of the content of school textbooks used during Nazi times. We find now in India the opposite situation. The new recommendations in the draft report on reforms in content and design of school textbooks recommends the reform and redesign of all textbooks. Professor Mahalakshmi, in an article in January in the Frontline, describes how these suggestions are made with the aim of communalizing Indian history textbooks without the regional diversities and women characters. The third piece in Resistible Rise is Lukács' fascist falsification of Goethe. Lukács depicts newspaper and journal responses to Goethe's death anniversaries written in 1932 and highlights how Goethe is defined in religious and nationalist terms. Here, Lukács pointed out how in Völkische Beobachter, in a German newspaper, Goethe is portrayed as the humble subject. This attitude of servility is the attitude of servility that can appeal to the petit bourgeoisie. The fascicization of Goethe in the piece also meant Goethe's transformation into a nationalist Goethe. For example, Max Wundt characterizes Hermann und Dorothee as a hymn to German life rooted in the soil. Lukács also quotes another newspaper, Neue Preußische Kreuzzeitung, that claims that the Western spirit and its influence has been very corrupting for the German nation, and Goethe was always in conflict with this world. Lukács highlights that even Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologist of fascism, elevates Goethe to a forerunner of National Socialists, simply because of his liking for the mystical thinker Meister Eckhart. Lukács' response makes it clear that the issue of German heritage and a critical reckoning are at stake, and salvaging its positive values, historical universality and historical dialectic, that Lukács connects to Goethe and Hegel and Herder. Lukács regretted the fact that the liberal press was not able to counter the image of the rightist reception, and even Thomas Mann was only emphasizing Goethe's cosmopolitan sympathies, like a king of French and English literature, and others. Others emphasized the pacifist features of Goethe, instead of countering the false image which was created by the national fascists. We can also think of the current presentations and the current character presentations of Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and other characters of Indian history at this falsification of Goethe. Some other work by Lukács is extremely relevant for today's context in India. Lukács pursued similar ideas as in fascicization of Goethe in his work on fascicization in philosophy. Between 1930 and 1945, after his stay in Berlin until Hitler became the chancellor, he left for Moscow in 1933. In the new edition of there he worked in the Marx Engels Institute in the period when he completed young Hegel and studies in European realism, and wrote a number of reviews and critical pieces preparing the ground for the studies entitled Goethe and His Age, The Destruction of Reason, and the Historical Novel. Lukács worked on the destruction of reason that analyzed the intellectual developments in Germany between 1848 and 1933. And Lukács elaborated how Germany had become the center of fascist ideology for historical and ideological reasons. The historical reasons were the failure of the Peasant War in 1522, when the opportunity was missed to create a unified state and eliminate feudalism. Further, the revolution of 1848, when national unity was created from top down, which meant that Germany had become Prussianized. Due to the lack of democracy, tendencies like servility and aggression became pervasive. Lukács' book was a first attempt to analyze intellectual movements in their relationship to the prehistory of fascism. Lukács points out in The Destruction of Reason that there is no such thing as purely academic or innocent philosophy, and the responsibility of philosophers is to watch over the existence and development of reason. He defines irrationalism in The Destruction of Reason as the styling of the declared insolubility as an answer, along with the claim that this evasion and sidestepping of the answer, this flight from it, contains a positive solution, and true achievement of reality is irrationalism's decisive hallmark. In these books, Lukács also gives account of the elements that would later facilitate the spread of fascist ideology: reactionary cultural criticism, life philosophy, rationality that was the apology of capitalism, creation of myths, and the glorification of instincts, and also racism. The manuscript of German ideology was in the Marx and Engels Institute in Moscow, and this was being edited by Lukács and by his Russian colleague Mikhail Lifshitz. It served for Lukács as a model. Lukács calls the philosophers to account about the connection of their criticism with their own material world. That is, the connection of German philosophy with German reality, what Marx made the central problem in German ideology. Lukács' essay, Grand Hotel Abyss, that means Grand Hotel Abgrund in German, is a play on Adorno's middle name, Wiesengrund. It is a reference to Adorno. They represented different wings of Marxism, and it was typical that Adorno was in the United States while Lukács stayed in Moscow, despite of all the difficulties of staying in Moscow. In the course of time, he was actually arrested by the KGB and kept in jail for 2 months, but he was released. The Grand Hotel Abyss is a metaphorical, symbolical location, a place of comfort and luxury, where all intellectual positions are present at the time of crisis. The essay deals with the role of intellectuals as the crisis deepens. Lukács ascribes the major part of the responsibility to the intellectuals who had created that ideology. Every aesthetic question is transformed into an inability into an aesthetic quality, mood, self-criticism, a mythicization of the past. The inability to come to terms with the real situation drives them into various self-defeating positions as despair deepens. Grand Hotel Abyss provides the illusion of independence. There is space for self-torment, provision for establishing sects to resolve all cultural problems. The only requirement is intellectual quality, because problems are dealt with purely at an ideological level. The opposition to culture that would come from works like Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities or Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain can become the ideological self-defense of the bourgeoisie. Lukács publishes a long review about Musil's newly published novel, A Man Without Qualities, and writes with admiration about the intellectual quality of the novel, but draws the conclusion that it simply destroys all possible positions of the bourgeoisie. This severe judgment was also self-criticism. After all, he dealt with his favorite authors, the protagonists of his earlier work. Lukács' essay, Grand Hotel Abyss, recounts positions which are familiar from the destruction of reason. Radical utopian plans for various strata of the petty bourgeoisie, unwilling to commit oneself, relativist skepticism that can surface as religious mythology. Both in India and in Europe, we find many of these characteristics. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Bhattiji, you want to add something?
Unmute. Anil, unmute.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. There's a great deal which could be discussed, and I think this is also a good moment to suggest that the second edition of the Reader could be thought of as a project in which some of the papers which you have mentioned orally could be included and, as it were, as they say, become more topical. This would include analyses of India. It could include papers from the Weimar period which were not very well known, but till recently, like for instance, the Grand Hotel Abgrund or Abyss, and the review of Mann ohne Eigenschaften, Man Without Quality, which has not yet been translated as far as I know, and such other papers which are becoming more and more well known. There's an entire archive which is expanding, an archive of memory, and I think that's the reason why the dealing with our specific fascization of life in India requires a memory which needs expansion. So thank both of you for your presentation. And if there's, I do not know, Viraya, is there time for discussion, or is there any need for a discussion?
No, there are two clarifications sort of questions. Let me pose to them.
Yeah.
The first one is, I think you have already dealt with. After 15 years, as Sasuti told, it is for 15 years the book was published. So in these 15 years, the world moved further towards what we are calling as rightist measures in all sense. So do the authors feel that there is a need to revisit some of the formulations, or do they identify new formulations or characteristics of fascism? That's the first.
Should I respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay. No, I think, of course, there is need to look at, the facets of fascism as we experience it today. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, there have been dramatic changes. After all, the BJP has been in power now for so many years, and been able to change the nature of Indian society or intervene in the nature of Indian society in very significant ways. So, of course, a lot of study is required, and a lot of study is going on undoubtedly, which could be also brought into the discussion. That's but what we felt with as the objective of the reader was to bring to this reflection, even on our contemporary times, the way that the fascism as it emerged initially was understood through a Marxist lens. And I think that is quite helpful in even trying to understand the phenomenon today. Of course, there will be so many aspects, and I think some of them have been suggested also in what we pointed out. But it's very important because there's a tendency to look at fascist tendencies or fascist groups, etc., through superficial aspects, and to forget the class content of these kinds of movements. And that needs to be emphasized. If we keep that in mind, then we can look at all the other ways in which fascist groups, fascist parties, fascist governments function today, including in this country. But we are certainly not the competent persons to do this. That we can help with bringing such material to the discussion, but that is something which needs a different kind of expertise.
So the second question goes to, I think, either three of you can decide. A key element of fascism is linked to the imperialist expansion, the standard fascism, what we understood till now, Italian or Germany. So it is linked to the imperialist expansion. So, but in the post-globalized world, there is no possibility of such an expansion, but still the fascist tendencies are growing tight. So how to understand?
I think in today's world, imperialist expansion, or it means basically imperialist profit maximization, and that is what is the content of the neoliberal order. What is it that we have
in a sense, geographical
instituted through neoliberalism is the further maximization of profits for imperialism. That is very much part of this order. And it also goes along with war, intervention in all kinds of countries which are not, in other parts of the world. This is an additional aspect which goes along with it to keep that control over the world, to keep that hegemony over the world. And I think that is a very important aspect of today's times.
Well, if I may add something.
Yeah.
So that's what, what Shashwati said. I would like to add that, you can see here with the spread or the imperialism, geopolitical expansion, with the way even this recent example about Ukraine and all, we can see that it is actually near the oil fields. Ever since Iraq, it has become more and more clear that the US expansion, they won't leave until the energy resources are in this belt of Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and all. They are not going to leave these areas in,
In peace.
at peace. So, for example, there we see a very clear agenda. The other issue is that even in the form of, we know about the various aids which are given to third world countries or countries which are dependent on Western assistance. It turns out, and I was also surprised to find, that they all come with conditions, and very important trading conditions. So it's not that, and these are things which the average man like me does not know about. I also found out about this from a Swedish play, which was once shown in Delhi, or read out in Delhi University. So there are issues about this where people of culture and literature can also play a very important role. And yes, I think it's the responsibility highlighted by Lukács and others is extremely important in these areas.
Last question. The fascism is usually linked to the idea of fascism as a weapon in the hands of capitalism at various stages to stave off the danger of proletarian revolution. That was the theme, is a standard theme that is through the book at the theoretical level and also at the empirical. So, but since 70s, there is no such a threat of proletarian revolution across the world. But still, the tendency of fascism is growing. So, how to bridge the gap in understanding?
Yeah, that's a very important question, I think. The issue is, the first part of the theoretical formulation of the Marxists is that it is related to the imperialist period, but also the crisis that grips the capitalist system in this period. That crisis is very important. So the crisis we definitely have today. We have the crisis all over the world. You are right that we don't have an organized working class movement resisting this. But this crisis is facing opposition in a variety of ways. And this is what I tried to suggest also at the end, that there are, and in different parts of the world, it is facing opposition. If you look, for instance, at Latin America at the moment, there are, one by one, many of the Latin American countries are, unchaining themselves from the pressure of imperialism. Most recently, as we have seen in the case of Nicaragua, which for quite some time was held hostage by, imperialism, but it is a movement which one can notice in across Latin America. Okay, we still have a long way to go, undoubtedly. But let's take the case of India. I mean, the farmer struggle is something which was also a form of challenge, and it's a third world country, so more than it, along with the working class, it has a very large section of peasantry. So for countries like India and other third world countries, this the role of the peasantry in this fight also has to be looked at. I cannot theorize about it, but we can only look at what the farmer struggle provides us in terms of the experience of a very important battle against the neoliberal assault, and in the framework of a fascist approach to divide the struggle.
Margaret, anything to add to that?
Mari?
We are having internet problems here. I don't know where Mari is.
I mean, we can see her name, but not the video.
Mari? They can't see you.
I think
You just come over here.
She's in another room.
She's in another room, but now she's here behind me. So, do you want to add something?
On what?
On the fact that, we don't have an organized working class challenge to the capitalist system, which is very crucial to the 20s, 30s discussion.
Yeah, we don't, I would not see it in this form. Obviously, the working class has changed very dramatically since in the last 100 years. We have a very different working class, and the forms are very different in which also resistance is forming itself. And in all this, it's also very difficult to recognize it because there is a quite strong mistrust to parliamentary politics and political parties, therefore, legalized, recognized political parties. So I can see in that sense more, more the movements in the form of mass movements, like what we had here last year or the year before last, about citizenship, about issues which are the real issues of contemporary life. So I would say it, or I would formulate it like this. So the main issue is that we don't have working class in the old form. Now, very often working class, the working class movements have moved to home offices, and, they have various many people work black all over the world. So we can, and therefore they have far less access to various legalized movements or trade union movements, and not speaking about the way the governments clamp down to trade union movements. So that also makes it very difficult to be part of government or anti-establishment movements.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, there's an interesting recent event which we could also sort of look at, and that is, for instance, the strike against Amazon by workers in 20 countries. I mean, this is also a very dispersed kind of working class. No, it's totally dispersed. How do you get in touch with each other, etc.? But they seem to have established that, and they had this strike in 20 countries together. So some new forms are emerging even in this new context which Mari was describing.
So now the same thing is happening, are going to happen in Starbucks, where almost all 26 countries of US, states of US is going to be unionized. There's a huge struggle going on. Anilji, shall we wind up at this?
I think we should wind up, and perhaps it's just a general observation that would be really worth it, having a second expanded version of this reader with completely new names, new part of an archive. Obviously, the editors may feel a little overburdened with their present work and would not be able to devote so much time to it. But we could think in terms perhaps with of having a new team and exploring possibilities of adding new papers to deal with the new situation and what forms of resistance are developing, what changing forms of resistance are developing. If that, I think that would be a good way of looking at it positively, that there is something, there is a base, we can expand the archive in terms of analysis, and we can also think in intervening in the present situation, taking into account the new developments. Maybe we could close with that remark.
Thank you, Anilji. It's very interesting, but not only interesting, it's very necessary and urgent task that is to be done on the part of the academia, particularly activist academia, because there is a lot of gap in understanding, gap in the literature. That's what made me to bring this book to the notice of the public. So I hopefully these videos will be made into small pieces and then be circulated to a larger audience, hoping that they will be they will evince some interest. Having said that, I must express my gratitude on behalf of my team, Manjupustakam, for accepting my request for three of you, Anilji and Margitji and Shashwatiji. And I hope we made it the day. And it's the end of the day. It's a very good suggestion, and I hope both the editors and the publishers of this book, Resistible Rise, will seriously consider to bring out Resistible Rise 2.0.
Yeah. Phase 2.
Yeah. Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you very much.
It was lovely to be together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.